Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. Have you ever ignored your doctor's advice? Most doctors enter the medical field with noble intentions, but are unaware of the systemic corruption and profit-driven nature of the industry. The hard economic truth is that nearly every institution that impacts your health makes more money by managing chronic disease than by curing patients. The pharmaceutical industry has influenced medical research and treatment, leading to a focus on recurring revenue through chronic medication and intervention over prevention. As a result, many doctors feel trapped inside a broken system. Modern healthcare isn't working because it focuses on treating symptoms rather than addressing the root cause of metabolic dysfunction, which can be caused by three physiological processes: mitochondrial dysfunction, chronic inflammation, and oxidative stress. To explore these subjects and more, we're here today with Casey Means, MD. Dr. Means is a Stanford-trained physician and co-founder of Levels, a health technology company with the mission of reversing the world's metabolic health crisis. Her best-selling new book on metabolic health is called Good Energy. Before we get to the interview, a quick heads up. I'm launching a brand new Substack channel. I'll be writing about health, performance, and technology, sharing our favorite recipes, podcasts, videos, and much more. You can find me by looking up Abel James in the search bar on Substack, and you can join for free or even support my work directly as a member. So come join the Abel James Substack channel and leave a quick comment so that we can connect. I always love hearing from you. All right, on to this show with Dr. Casey Means. In this episode, we chat about how metabolic dysfunction affects various cell types in the body, leading to diverse symptoms and diseases, why it's a problem that nutrition science is funded largely by food manufacturers and healthcare research is funded by pharmaceutical companies, how the complexity and confusion surrounding health and wellness is intentional as it creates a need for external experts and products, why the profit-driven healthcare system prioritizes managing chronic diseases over curing them, leading to widespread metabolic dysfunction and premature mortality, how to optimize your metabolic function with simple and inexpensive lifestyle strategies, and much more. All right, let's go hang out with Dr. Casey Means. Welcome back, folks. Today we're here with Casey Means, MD, a Stanford-trained physician, co-founder of Levels, a health technology company with the mission of reversing the world's metabolic health crisis, and author of the fantastic new book, Good Energy. Dr. Casey trained in head and neck surgery before leaving traditional medicine to devote her life to tackling the root cause of why Americans are sick. She's been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Women's Health, and many more. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Casey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So one of the things that you mention in your work is that fearlessness is the highest level of good energy. And I just want to say that you're a great example to other people because in reading your book, Good Energy, it seems quite fearless. From where I'm standing, you say a lot of courageous things.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I think fundamentally right now we're in an interesting time in human history where there is a currency of fear that's really being used against us to drive so much consumer decision making. And if we can sell to the world that it's a very fearful place to be and that it's a fearful time to be alive, then it creates an opportunity to sell people a lot of solutions to deal with that existential angst. And so I think you see that happening a lot with people self-censoring. People don't want to say what they really feel. There's a lot of this block of flow, I think, of really sharing what's inside of us. And one thing that I really have been reflecting on a lot is how fundamentally the root of our chronic disease epidemic in the United States and in the Western world is actually also a blocking of flow. If you think about insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction, it's literally the cells blocking the entry of glucose into the cell to be transformed into a currency of energy that powers our lives. That's insulin resistance, that's metabolic dysfunction, that's what stems from mitochondrial dysfunction, it's blocking. And so I think a big part of actually healing our chronic disease epidemic is understanding that there's this stifling on every level of humanity right now that we really need to break through if we're going to turn the tide of health in the country. We need to unleash that incredible sort of flowing energy through our minds, our bodies, our voices, and of course, our cells.
Yeah, and in reading through your book, I'm just like, geez, you're coming out swinging. You're calling people out. You're calling out institutions, industries, the media, and what a unique position to do that from as well, especially in conjunction with your brother, who's worked with a lot of these food and pharma companies, and you've worked deeply within medicine now outside of it with your own practice for a while and running levels as well. What a fascinating perspective to tackle a lot of these issues. And I totally agree with you. I mean, being on uh, the wrong end of, or at least feels wrong from my perspective, of shadow banning, censorship, and that whole charade that's kind of been going on for many years now. It's so important that you come out and kind of tell things how they are again, because like a lot of people have experienced this now. You don't know exactly what you said that ruffled feathers that was wrong, but we need people to go out there and call out the things that are wrong, especially these broken systems. And the way that you explained it as well in terms of doctors feel trapped inside a broken system. Maybe you can just riff on that a little bit, because I think you're a wonderful example to other people who want to heal, especially doctors and practitioners. And it's pretty easy for some people to vilify the medical establishment or even doctors themselves, but that's not really the right way to think about this.
Yeah. Every single doctor I know, and I know hundreds, of course, having been in the medical field and going to medical school, every single doctor I know went into medicine for the noblest of intentions. No one goes into medicine to make tons of money. There are far easier ways to make an income than 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, 3 to 7 years of residency, fellowship training, multiple licensing exams. It's wild. It's a wild ride. And people go into it because they want to help others and they want to improve human thriving. But what is very much not clear when you are going into your medical training is that you are entering a system that is fundamentally a business. And healthcare is not only the largest industry in the United States, it is also the fastest growing industry in the United States. It employs tens of millions of people. Over $4 trillion are spent on healthcare every year. It is deeply intertwined, of course, with the industrial food system, the pharmaceutical industry, the whole hospital systems across the country. It's very complex. And as a doctor, you're entering a business that is large, is growing, and that is predicated on a simple and stark economic reality that I don't think any entering medical school student really understands, which is that every single institution that touches our health in the Western world, from the doctor's office to hospitals to pharmaceutical companies, even to insurance companies, will make more money when patients are sick, and they will make less money when patients are healthy. And that reality, coupled with the magnitude of this business, creates a profound invisible hand and system that shapes every aspect of what we learn, how we practice, how we are paid, how we value our own work, and what we even think of as valuable care. It impacts the research. It impacts the scientific organizations within our government, like the NIH. And so at every level, there's this insidious compromising of the way we think about healthcare that is driven towards intervention, reaction, separatism, and very much away from root cause, holistic, sort of systems-based approaches to proactive healthcare. So we enter a system with noble intentions and then are basically sucked into a giant $4 trillion washing machine that is, in order to grow, requires us to believe that the best way to practice is reactive, highly specialized, intervention-based healthcare. And in this long, arduous journey of becoming a doctor, so much sacrifice, financial, emotional, spiritual, we essentially have to put a lot of faith into that to basically give ourselves the sense of, the force within us to keep going within that. And so we believe in that system and we believe in it deeply. So you get doctors really buying into this, and it becomes very, very difficult 10 years in, $500,000 in debt, working 100 hours a week to sort of pop your head up and say, wait, is this system potentially all wrong? Is there potentially another way that's actually cheaper, simpler, more empowering, totally different? Is it possible that a lot of the research that is, quote, the evidence, the science, is it possible that a lot of it is actually wrong? And that just becomes too hard of a challenge, I think, for people to do. And that's, I think, what we're seeing. We're seeing good people in a system that has bad incentives. And now we have a country in which 93% of American adults are metabolically dysfunctional, and 9 out of 10 leading causes of death in the United States are like essentially lifestyle preventable diseases that are leading to just incredible suffering and premature mortality. And no one really knows what to do. And a lot of that is just based on this stark, simple economic reality that we need to wake up to if we're going to move the ship in a different direction.
And you write in your book as well something that's just is so powerful. The most important 13 days of my life came from ignoring a team of doctors. Maybe you can just tell that story a bit and offer the human perspective, seeing everything from that end, with your own family.
Absolutely. So so this, what you're referring to is the through line throughout the entire book, which is the story of my mother. And I think that this story is one that I think many people listening can probably see themselves in or their family in. And so I'll share it briefly. My mom, Gail, who was just my absolute best friend, my hero, when she had me when she was about 40. And when she was pregnant with me, she gained about 75 pounds during pregnancy. And when she gave birth to me, I was almost a 12-pound baby. I was a very large baby. And no one really made much of that. Actually, people kind of congratulated her for having a big baby. Flash forward, she had a lot of trouble losing the baby weight. So sort of from pre-pregnancy to post-pregnancy, she essentially became overweight, and that was very hard for her to lose. So she's in her 40s, she's having trouble losing the baby weight. Now she's sort of in the overweight category. Her late 40s, she goes through perimenopause, has a very tough menopause. She has lots of sleep disturbances, hot flashes, mood symptoms. And of course, the doctors say, this is very common. There's very little we can do about menopausal symptoms. So sorry. Gets into her 50s, she starts to develop high cholesterol, high LDL, low HDL, high triglycerides. The doctor again says, this is very normal for women your age. Here's a statin. This medication is prescribed 200 million times a year in the United States. Very, very common. We'll medicate it, nothing to worry about. She gets into her 60s and her blood sugar starts going up and she's got prediabetes. And the doctor says, oh yeah, well, this is a pre-disease. Like, we'll give you some metformin. Again, another medication, very common, 90 million prescriptions for metformin a year. We'll track it closely. All good. Keeps going on into her 60s, develops the high blood pressure. They say, very, very common. This is almost a rite of passage in the United States. Give her an ACE inhibitor. She's on her way. She's taking all of these medications faithfully. And then she's 72 and she's religiously taking all of her medications, seeing all of her different specialists. And she's taking a hike with my dad near their home in Northern California. And she has a very, very intense acute pain in her stomach. She has to sit down on her hike and it lasts for a few days. So she goes to the doctor's office and her primary care doctor, because she's never had the stomach pain before and it's been going on for several days, says, we'll get a CT scan, we'll check it out. So she gets the CT scan and later that day, she gets a text message to her phone. And the text message says, stage 4, widely metastatic pancreatic cancer. And 13 days later, she was dead. And at the time of her passing, she was seeing what people would call, the best doctors in the country. She was getting executive physicals at Mayo Clinic. She had her primary care doctor at Palo Alto Medical Foundation, which is associated with Stanford. And the doctors, looked us in the eye and said, we're so sorry. This is so unlucky. And, I think that term unlucky, I think in our conventional healthcare system and to these doctors, I genuinely think that they believe that it was unlucky. And in our sort of highly specialized system where we see the blood pressure and the glucose and the cholesterol and the overweight and the having a huge baby and difficulty losing the baby weight, we see all those things as separate things because of our framework. The cancer did seem random. But I sort of knew enough to know that actually, if we were looking at this from a different perspective, a root cause cellular physiology perspective, a metabolic perspective, and actually looking at the connections between all these things my mom was dealing with, what we would see is that the cancer was completely predictable. The cancer was one way of the body saying the same thing it had been saying for 30 years, which is that there's metabolic dysfunction happening in the cells. But through our reactive whack-a-mole healthcare system, where we don't see those connections, we are trained to ignore the connections and to just stay in our lanes of our 42 medical subspecialties. It seems random. And so that experience, coupled with what I had been seeing in my life as a head and neck surgeon, this highly, highly specialized surgeon who was so focused on the inflammation of the ear, nose, and throat that I never really ever thought about the rest of the body and how those symptoms I was treating were actually related to so many of the other conditions my patients had. And when I started going down that road, it really woke me up and helped me become, a really root cause medicine evangelist and focus on what are the connections between all these conditions that are going up at the exact same time in the United States over the last 50 to 75 years. And where that journey takes you is directly to the center of the cell to a set of very clear physiologic disturbances that are caused by the environment we're living in the modern world that has changed so rapidly over the past 100 years, and realizing that our cell's response to these huge changes in the way that we're living and the environment around us, the response to those environmental changes is a set of core physiologic disturbances that are showing up as all these different diseases that we're seeing today in the United States. And that some of these earlier symptoms, like having a large baby, which is literally called fetal macrosomia, which is a direct sign of brewing metabolic dysfunction, from that to bad perimenopausal symptoms, to high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high glucose, and cancer, are just all across the spectrum of metabolic dysfunction. And we need to see them on that spectrum so that we can address the early warning signs before they become these sort of lethal end states that so many Americans are dealing with today, and causing just such devastating premature mortality.
And maybe you could touch upon the incentives a bit as well, because in those 13 days, basically you were forced to make, and your mother as well, a very, very difficult choice, which is go through all of these procedures and kind of see what happens, or actually spend some time with your family. And I was really touched reading that, a few of the pieces of that story in the book as well. So maybe you could just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah. So, right when she got that diagnosis, of course, the healthcare system sprung into action. This is what we're all trained to do. You get that big diagnosis, and now it's like full court press. You need a liver stent. We need to do this invasive biopsy. We need to start the chemo. We need to get you into all these doctors. And, during that time, we started asking questions, of course, and said, what are the benefits of these things that you're recommending? And it was during COVID, and we also knew that anything she was going to have done in the hospital, she would have to go in, and we would not be able to be with her. Who knows if she'd ever be able to come out. Her cancer was so advanced when it presented that her body was actually destroying a lot of its red blood cells, which is like another complicating factor. So I said, in the light of stage 4 widely metastatic pancreatic cancer, and she's got this hemolytic anemia happening, what are the chances that everything you're saying are going to help her? And the reality is that the doctor said there's about a 33% chance that it makes things worse. There's about a 33% chance that it doesn't really do much. And then there's a 33% chance that, she may do better. And doing better means maybe a few more months of life. And so we said, well, that doesn't sound so great. If the best case scenario is that she's getting every other day blood transfusions and gets to live for a few more months, my mom was also very clear that her biggest fears were pain and nausea. And the treatments, of course, would lead to both of those things. So we decided as a family that, and my mom, led this decision that we were going to go home and she was going to go on hospice. And she was able to spend those 13 days very comfortable, staring out at the ocean, reading hundreds and hundreds of letters and poems and tributes from people throughout her life who, sent her these beautiful messages. And, she died by candlelight, surrounded by flowers and family, super peacefully at home. And all of that would have been completely taken away from her had we done the very strong recommendation of the healthcare system, which was the full court press. And one of the most, I would say, the most powerful moment of my entire life was the day before my mom passed away, when she was kind of in and out of consciousness. She sort of came to, and I was really having trouble speaking at that time, but she was able to indicate to us that she wanted to go to the place where she was going to be buried. So we carried her to the car and put her in a wheelchair, and she was able to be actually buried in a beautiful natural burial site, a forest grove just a few miles from my parents' house. And we went and we sat in a circle as a family at the place where she would be buried just a few days later. And my dad knelt in front of her, and, she cupped his face, and she couldn't really speak, but they looked at each other, and the sort of look and the energy that they exchanged after almost 40 years of marriage, it was, to me, that was like the meaning of life. And it was just a moment I'll never, ever forget. And to think that those types of moments are being robbed from people, every day around the country, just because people are afraid to ask questions and to and because the healthcare system so entrenches fear and just weaponizes the fear of death against people, so much so that they just feel like they'll kind of do anything, like any procedure that's recommended from these institutions of trust. And not everyone has a doctor in the family that can sort of boldly ask questions, but it really woke me up to, there is a cost to doing everything and to doing the huge interventions. And that cost is sometimes, being able to die on your own terms and with dignity in a way that is profoundly healing for that whole family and for the person. And I would say, because of that time we shared together, I was able to move through the sadness of her death and our whole family in such a powerful and transformational and positive way. And the way that probably I imagine that death could be handled by a lot of people, but because of the way the system, takes control of this part of life in a very opportunistic and profiteering way, I think so many of these mystical, transcendental moments are desanctified, sterilized, and separated from people. And I think that's really a very dark part of our healthcare system.
Yeah, and you offer the metaphor of like, kind of the approach that the medical system tends to take with these folks who have been showing signs for many years in most cases that something is amiss in terms of their metabolic dysfunction. Is that it's kind of like taking a car to the mechanic once it's totaled.
Right. Right. The little tune up at that point isn't going to do a whole lot, right? Like where were all these people 40 years earlier to help her put the pieces together of what was actually happening inside her cells? They were nowhere. Everyone was practicing respectable medicine, quote unquote respectable medicine, which is essentially turning knobs on biomarkers with medication, but not actually focusing on what really needs to happen to heal the American body, which is actually improve the functioning of our cells, which none of these medications do. And so that's really the call to action with this book is, how do we reframe healthcare from doing things to actually healing cells? And those are two very, very different things. And it's not something that we learn how to do in medical school.
I love the way as well that you explain metabolic dysfunction because, I've had so many people on the show talking about mitochondria and cells and like all sorts of jargon, especially for people who are just like trying to get healthy. What do we do next? People who are listening. And explaining it as the cells being in the mitochondria dysfunctional, but mostly underpowered, kind of sputtering for energy. And that causes dysfunction, autoimmunity. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit next, because I love the way that you frame it and explain it.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Metabolism is, I think it's the most beautiful, miraculous process in the world, and one that we can all improve our health, I think, just honestly by meditating on this miraculous process happening inside our body, which is basically that metabolism is in the sort of sciencey language, how we convert food energy to cellular energy. And so we take this potential energy in the chemical bonds of the food that we eat, and we put that into our body. And then if things are working properly, we can unleash that potential energy and turn it into a form of energy, ATP, that then goes on to power every chemical reaction inside our cells. There are trillions of chemical reactions happening every second in our cells. They all have to be paid for by the cellular energy. And when that's all humming along properly, that bubbles up into a healthy and happy life, because we have cells that literally have the energy they need to do their work. And when that process is not working properly, there's this block of energy flow from the food we're eating, the 2 to 3 pounds of food we eat every single day. There's a block to that turning into an energy currency that we can use to power our lives. And just like any machine that doesn't have the power that it needs to work, it's going to be dysfunctional. You're not going to get the output you want. And that is the root of our chronic disease epidemic. And I think a lot of people might say, like, well, it's a pretty big thing to say that like all these issues that we're facing that seem so different are actually rooted in the same thing. And, I talk about in the book, the spectrum of metabolic disease. It ranges from everything from ADHD and autism and neurodevelopmental issues of childhood to skin issues like psoriasis and eczema and acne and premature aging and wrinkles, to mental health and brain issues like Alzheimer's, dementia, depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, migraine, to cardiovascular issues from stroke and heart attack and erectile dysfunction and retinopathy, all which have to do with not enough blood flow, to infertility, polycystic ovarian syndrome. It's just, and to gout, to chronic liver disease, to chronic kidney disease, to worse COVID outcomes. Every single thing I just mentioned, if you just go on PubMed and look at really the physiology of these things, they all are rooted in metabolic dysfunction. And I think a big question is like, how is that possible? And the way to understand it is that we have 200 plus cell types in our body. We have all these different specialized types of cells, like the retinal cell and the ovarian theca cell and the endothelial cell lining the blood vessel of the penis and the astrocyte in the brain and the hepatocyte in the liver, all these different cell types. Each one needs energy to do its job. And a cell that's doing its job well is going to function properly and won't express symptoms and disease. So underpowering in a liver cell is obviously going to look differently and express itself differently than underpowering in a glial cell or an astrocyte in the brain. It's going to look different than an ovarian theca cell being underpowered. So it's not, yes, the symptoms and the signs that develop from that dysfunction look different, but what's actually happening inside the cell to drive that dysfunction is the same process. And that is just a really key fundamental thing. The system definitely does not want us to understand this, because if you understood that, you'd have to fix and pay for one problem, which is metabolic dysfunction, as opposed to literally hundreds of problems, which is the way our system benefits, is that you have all these specialists and all these different types of doctors and all these different types of medication, none of which actually fix the root cause. They sort of dabble with the downstream symptom and manifestation of that. And this is why you have to step back and realize the more specialties we invent in healthcare, the sicker we're getting. The more drugs we prescribe in the United States for these different chronic illnesses, the increase in the rates of these diseases. So the more drugs for the diseases, the higher amounts of these diseases we get. The more specialties, the more diseases. Literally, the more research that we publish on these diseases, the worse the diseases are getting. Of course, the more we spend on healthcare, the worse the outcomes are getting. So that's sort of the the thing we need to reflect on is that it's not working because we're not actually approaching the right problem. We're dilly-dallying with the whack-a-mole medicine on the symptom management and not actually focusing on the root cause of what's happening, which is metabolic dysfunction, which even deeper, I talk about what that's really caused by, which is 3 distinct physiologic processes, the trifecta of bad energy, which is mitochondrial dysfunction, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, all of which are modifiable by the choices we make every day in terms of how we're living our lives. So what we eat, our sleep quality, our stress management, our movement, our exposure to toxins, our exposure to light at different times of the day, and our exposure to temperature. And so if we focus on that one problem, and when people heal their metabolism and create a life force within their cells that can actually power our body to function properly, a lot of these symptoms and diseases melt away. And so that's really the call to action of this book, is how do we reimagine a future for humanity and the healthcare system that bases our work on a foundation of reality and truth, that is actually so much simpler and less complex than we've been led to believe. The complexity and the confusion is part of the business model, right? Because that gets us to go to all these different sources to pay for solutions, essentially. But it's actually so much simpler than I think many of us imagine. And that's the beauty and the opportunity of a way forward based in good energy and metabolic optimization.
And along those lines of overcomplicating things, especially as the word biohacking has taken off, and with the cold plunges and the light panels and all the various things that people should be doing every single day, there are a lot of whiz bang magic bullets flying around, it seems like. And in your work, you offer that maybe we're getting a bit carried away with some of these more extraneous pieces of the puzzle in terms of longevity and optimization, when we really should be focusing more on the simplicity. And maybe there are a lot of things to check off on that list, but it doesn't need to be overly complicated. And you certainly don't need to be jumping into like a chest freezer 7 times a day or whatever a lot of people are doing these days. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit next. What are some of the pillars that will help address these issues, maybe more so than some of the kind of extremes that you might see on the internet?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would just mention is that it's just so funny that we are the only species on planet Earth that has experts. And yet we are the only species on planet Earth that has a chronic disease and obesity epidemic. Like there's no giraffes or lions running around with epidemic rates of obesity and chronic illness, and yet they don't have PubMed and they don't have experts. And so there's this real thing that's happened where we have been asked to essentially give away our internal knowing and our internal power of what's right for us in our body. And then also coupling with this just distraction industrial complex that we're in as a modern Americans, where we're constantly looking at our screens and we're constantly driving and busy, and productivity is basically God in our culture. And so because of that, we can't even hear our internal wisdom or what our bodies are saying. So we first of all don't have time or the stillness to even hear it. And then we've also been told essentially not to trust it. It's not trust yourself, it's trust the science. And I think that that's a really interesting place to start, because I do think a lot of what's going to actually heal us is reclaiming the incredible internal body wisdom and power that we have as these, miraculous organisms with huge, incredible brains that, frankly, I think know exactly what we need to do to be healthy. And we have been divorced from our common sense. So I think a lot of this, it's not, people will say in the health books, if we just had more research, on nutrition, if we just were doing the studies properly. I have a different conclusion, which is that we need fewer studies. We do not need more studies. We need to get back to our common sense. And if we're going to do studies, a lot of what we should be doing is true core molecular biology research. But I think that, a reason why one of the chapters in my book is called your body has the answers is because I'm actually so optimistic for the future. We can overcome the diet and nutrition wars. We can overcome all the confusion because we are living in this incredible, miraculous time in human history, first time ever, where we have access to the traditional wisdom and the more body awareness type of wisdom of like, if we slow down and listen to what our bodies are saying and realize that our symptoms are actually a gift, our symptoms are the way that our cells are telling us that they're not getting what they need. If our cells were getting what they need, we would not have symptoms. Symptoms cannot arise out of thin air. Symptoms are necessarily the result of cellular dysfunction. So listening to our symptoms, hearing them as a gift, trying to understand what our bodies actually need, and then couple this with the tools and technology of the past 3 years that for the first time ever allow us to individually get more information about our health than any doctor could have ever given us in history. We can, with a click of a button, get 100 biomarkers ordered, and we can have them drawn the next day at a lab nearby and have that information delivered to us with incredible functional medicine interpretations for less than $500, less than what the copay for getting probably 5 labs would be at the doctor's office. We also have access to continuous biosensors like continuous glucose monitors, which can tell us literally in real time exactly how the food we're eating is affecting our metabolic health. And we have the other types of wearables that can tell us about heart rate variability, sleep quality, oxygen saturation, temperature. And so these tools and technology of just the last couple years, the cheaper access to these things, coupled with sort of this more internal knowing and traditional wisdom together, if we can use those effectively in individuals, we can live longer and happier lives than probably anyone in human history. But a lot of that comes back to actually taking ownership of your own health and using the best of what modernity has to live your life, make choices, try things out, and then learn if it's working, which we can definitively know through the combinations of things I just talked about. So how do you become the expert? How do you, trust both your internal knowing and the biomarkers to have the answers for yourself and cut through a lot of the existential angst that ultimately benefits other people and not ourselves?
So you brought up we don't need more studies, and I loved this little piece of the book as well. Nutrition science is funded largely by food companies, and healthcare research is largely funded by pharmaceutical companies. Why is that an issue? And also, what happened in 1910?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different factors that I think have led to where we are today. One of which is that there was something called the Flexner Report, which came out in the early 1900s, where essentially when John D. Rockefeller realized that you could take the byproducts of petroleum processing and actually make pharmaceutical medications, he commissioned a report that became the Flexner Report, which still guides decision making in Congress today, which essentially pushed a very pharmaceutical first perspective of Western medicine and demonized more natural and traditional practices. And actually, and now this is so built into the way we practice that we don't even question like where that came from. And then there were movements that basically happened where people started realizing like, if we can put people on a medication for life, this is essentially the definition of recurring revenue. And the first chronic medication was actually the birth control pill. And now, of course, it's everything that all Americans are taking, the hypertension medications, the cholesterol, now there's Wegovy for obesity, it's everything. And so this is fundamentally was really more of an economic decision to create just like recurring revenue. Prior to that, it was so much more about acute illnesses. So we might have a bacterial infection and then you get an antibiotic, you take it for 5 days, the infection heals and you're done. That's a one-time. The LTV of that customer is low. Whereas if there's chronic disease, that's something that someone's going to be on for decades. And it's very sad because if you actually think about what is the most profitable for the American healthcare system, it is a sick child. And a chronically ill child, which virtually didn't exist 50 years ago. Kids who have acquired lifestyle issues that they will have for life. A chronically ill child is a child that's going to be put on a medication for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And so, again, a lot of it comes back to following the money. But I think one of the things that we're going to really need to do and demand as consumers, if we truly want to change the corrupted ecosystem that's at every level of healthcare, and to really pick out the weeds that are causing the problems, is to get the money out of the scientific research, to get the money out of the USDA and the FDA, the NIH, and academic institutions, because whether we like it or not, the corporate interests from big ag, big food, big pharma, underwriting a lot of these institutions is going to, of course, change the way that we do research. It's going to change the way we think about health, and it's definitely a root cause problem. There was a astonishing Goldman Sachs headline from it was about 2 years ago, that actually wrote a report that said, a Goldman Sachs report that says, curing diseases may not be economically viable. And essentially what they were talking about was specifically related to gene therapy, where if you could give people essentially a one-time gene therapy, it potentially would cure a disease forever. And in this report, which got uncovered, it talked about how this would essentially stifle innovation in the field because it's not an economically viable business model. So at every level, the way that we're actually approaching health and disease is rooted in how to have highest lifetime value from a customer. So it's dark. But
Yikes.
That's why we all have to, I think we have to wake up and realize that when it comes to chronic diseases, we have to be in charge of our health. Absolutely, in the face of an acute life-threatening illness, the healthcare system has produced miracles. And we say that in the book very, very clearly. We are excellent at approaching acute illnesses like trauma, like if you do have an acute cardiac event, which of course that is the result of chronic disease. But if you have an acute coronary event, if you have a car accident, if we do have a life-threatening infection, those acute issues, absolutely, the healthcare system has produced miracles. And but it's the medicalization of lifestyle-related illnesses that has been an abject failure, where the more we do, the worse the outcomes are getting. And that's where we need to all be informed, eyes open consumers and understand the root cause of it, which is metabolic dysfunction, learn how to monitor and track it, which is the tools and technologies that we just talked about, and then learn how to optimize it, which is so much simpler than we think.
Yeah. And when you look at ultra processed foods and kind of the norms in our culture, when you talk about how we've normalized giving these ultra processed foods to children, starting off their lives that way, kind of building in those neural pathways of addiction to foods that really wouldn't exist in nature. And the fact that about 70% of the calories consumed in the US are from these ultra processed foods. The answer may be somewhat simple, but we need to change the norms and reframe how we're approaching food. And also when you look at the medical establishment, how they kind of poo-poo talking about food. It's something I think you also mentioned in the book, where it's like, I didn't become a surgeon to talk about food and nutrition,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I literally
what a powerful statement.
Well, and I believed, I've always been passionate about nutrition, but when I would talk about it in the hospital and say, hey, like, this person's come back for revision sinus surgery 3 times. Like, I was doing a little bit of research about inflammatory disorders like sinusitis and how there's some foods that are inflammatory. And I got 2 different responses, one of which is in the book and one of which was cut from the book. But the first one is that, you didn't become a surgeon to give nutrition advice. Like, basically, like, that's wimpy. And then the second one is that I had a senior physician in my department. I was talking about nutritional interventions for sinusitis, and they said, don't be a pussy. And
Whoa.
I'm like a 26-year-old girl, and I'm just like, holy shit. And, they we'll have to bleep that, but it's like, that's the vibe. That's the vibe. Because who's the hero in the American healthcare system? It's the heart surgeon cracking open the chest with a bone saw, putting that patient on cardiac bypass, doing a $500,000 surgery where they're like basically near death, and rerouting the blood flow, the plumbing of the heart to avoid a blockage. And that's the hero. And who's the wimp? The dietitian in the hospital who's coming by to like talk to the patient about, healthy whole foods eating. And the greatest irony of the healthcare system is that under no circumstances does that cardiac surgery in any way change the disease course or the physiology of the disease, the physiology that led to the heart blockage. Nothing. If anything, it will make it potentially worse because you're generating all this inflammation in the body from the surgery. The nutritionist, if properly trained and doing functional, nutrition, that person actually can reverse the disease. They can reverse the heart plaques that are leading to the blockages. And yet we dismiss that as almost an afterthought in our conventional system. Very much infantilized, paternalistic, might be nice to have, but the patient's not going to do it. If we flipped that and put all of our ammo, respect, a unified voice from healthcare towards those strategies that actually can reverse the physiology, which is the nutrition and the lifestyle and things that actually get at oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, and mitochondrial dysfunction, we'd have a completely different country. Everything would be different, but that's not how we think. And it's astonishing how much this culture influences medical students. I remember being, 25, my final year of medical school. I'm at Stanford, and I'm like, I'm a badass, and therefore I am going to become a head and neck surgeon, and I'm going to be the shit, and it was just like, this almost like a visceral thing of like, I'm smart. I want to be the best. I'm going to be a surgeon. And then 5 years later, flash forward, I'm standing over my 8th patient of the week, getting revision sinus surgery, feeling like, what the hell am I doing? Like, no one's getting better. These patients just keep coming back, and feeling really like an out of body experience of like, what have I done? What am I doing? And knowing that I needed to learn a different way if I actually wanted to be the healer that I went into medicine to become.
I'm curious, just personally, how do you handle that? Going from being the badass, like top of the world in your own field, very, very well trained and experienced at that point, to just, you kind of have to give it up, right? Like you have to give up that whole world and start over, except now that whole world is looking down at you. Right? And what was that like?
A lot of it comes down to, this is why I wrote a book, honestly, is because there were books that inspired me to think differently. And I think about like some of these incredible leaders in functional medicine. I've got my bookshelf here. I'm like thinking about Mark Hyman, Sarah Gottfried, David Perlmutter, Terry Walls, Neil Bernard, Dean Ornish, just all these incredible people across all sorts of different dietary philosophies, but like Dave Asprey, Ben Greenfield, and Steve Gundry. And, it's so interesting. Like because I was so fortunate to, when I'm younger, I was always in awe of food and nutrition. I studied nutrigenomics at Stanford, and that's basically the science of how food compounds impact gene expression. And so I had this sort of like baseline of like, okay, food is powerful. And then of course I spent 9 years of training essentially being told that food doesn't matter at all. And so because I had that baseline curiosity, I was reading these books on the side, and they get your fingers in there, and there's a different way. And that's why a lot of these voices get silenced, right? Because if you can get into people's minds that there's a different way and ask them to have curiosity and ask questions, very dangerous, right, for the system. So of course, a lot of these people got the algorithms basically shut them down, especially during COVID, because they're asking people to think, is there more to the story? So that was getting its little fingers into my brain. And so as I became closer and closer to the end of my 9 years of training and about to really like launch and start to be this independent faculty surgeon who is essentially getting paid for how many surgeries I do, I think there was something about that moment in my life. I was about 31, about to sign a contract for faculty position after residency was over. And then you're really on your own 2 feet, right? There's no one above you that's like buffering you. It's you, a knife, and a person in front of you. And you have to sleep at night feeling comfortable with the decisions that you are independently making of how you're impacting that person's body. And surgery is very dramatic, like even though we normalize in our culture, it's a naked person unconscious on a table in front of you that you're going to cut into and permanently alter their body. And as an empathetic person, there was some screaming inside my head that was saying like, I think there might be another way to keep them actually off the operating table. And I think you need to explore that more. And once I started doing that, I just couldn't operate anymore. It wasn't even a difficult decision. It was just like, I can't do that. And another thing that happens at the end of residency is that a lot of people start counseling you about the business, like you're going to be going off, launching into the world. And basically the unofficial mantra of a private practice surgeon is you eat what you kill, which is a euphemism that means your livelihood is dependent on how many surgeries you do and how many surgeries you book. And I'm not in any way implying that people are, intentionally booking surgeries that are like unnecessary, but I do believe that economic reality is causing us to have blind spots to other ways that we could be approaching the patient in front of us. And that was just totally intolerable for me when I got to that point of sort of like launching. And so that was the closing of that chapter. And then when I really was able to internalize and adopt this reality that like my success criteria, my personal success criteria as a physician is not the like lab markers of my patients, like whether I got the LDL down by 10 points. It's not about turning knobs and following protocols and algorithms. Is the human being in front of me fundamentally thriving? Do their cells work? And are the biomarkers associated with true cellular thriving? Not just the biomarkers that we can change with medications, but the actual biomarkers that tell me about cellular health. Are they improving? Is this patient reducing their symptoms, feeling incredible, thriving, and able to move towards their highest purpose in this lifetime? The answer is yes. Then I respect myself. I can sleep at night. I feel good. And so sort of the opinion of the system became totally obsolete to me because I was operating on my own framework of success that I think every person needs to create for themselves in this lifetime and really be religiously committed to.
And look at you now. I mean, Levels, what a cool company and what a cool technology to be taking off right now. Because as you were saying, it really gives the regular person a large degree of transparency into what's happening from the inside out directly when they eat foods, when they exercise, when they don't sleep well, when they're not really kind of living the right lifestyle. It becomes pretty obvious if you're looking at your heart rate variability and combining that with a CGM. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the power of this technology and the fact that it should be on a lot of people's radar, even if they haven't tried it yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll just speak to glucose for a second, because that kind of, I think, gets us to sort of why continuous glucose monitoring can be so valuable and why I've devoted a lot of my time to bringing this technology to more people. We've talked a bit about metabolic dysfunction and this idea that fundamentally metabolism is like converting food energy to cellular energy to power our cells. When the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell that does this conversion process, when it is hurt, the flow of that food energy, which is fundamentally a lot of that is glucose, sugar, carbohydrate, when that mitochondria is not working properly, that flow of that glucose, that carbohydrate through the mitochondria into cellular energy is not going to work properly. And the mitochondria can be hurt by so many parts of our modern life, things that we've already kind of alluded to, which is like not getting enough sleep, not moving enough, not having enough muscle mass, too many environmental toxins, ultra-processed foods, synthetic toxins on our foods, artificial light at night, lots of chronic stress. All these things synergistically and uniquely hurt this beautiful machine that does that conversion process. So when it's hurt by all these aspects of our modern life, that flow of glucose through it is not working as properly, and we're underpowered. So the cell, being wise and smart, says, I can't deal with all this glucose. I can't do anything with it because I'm damaged. So I'm going to stop it from coming into the cell because there's nothing, I can't do anything with it. It's bad. So it does two things. The cell blocks the glucose entry into the cell, which is called insulin resistance, because insulin is the hormone that, helps glucose come through the cell. So it blocks the insulin signal, blocks the cell from coming in as essentially a compensatory mechanism for a broken machine within it that can't process the glucose. So two things happen. One, the glucose will rise in the bloodstream because it's not going into the cells because of the insulin resistance. And two, we're going to have things like triglycerides rise in the blood because the body's going to convert some of that extra glucose into fat for storage. So you often see glucose rising along with triglycerides, fundamentally rooted in mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance. Another thing that will happen is that insulin levels will rise because the body's like, we got to get this glucose into the cell, even though the mitochondria is not working. We're just going to produce more insulin to try and force the glucose in, but that doesn't really work. So you very often we'll see this pattern in the body of high glucose, high insulin, high triglycerides, and those are key biomarkers that I ask people to track in the book. So that's one of the reasons why actually knowing what's going on with glucose in your bloodstream is so important, because it's a bit of a readout telling you there's actually potentially a problem inside the cell, a problem that, if not fixed, can fundamentally lead to that whole spectrum of diseases that we talked about, which is also why we know both metabolic dysfunction and erratic glucose levels are related to all those conditions that I listed earlier in the episode. So it's this really important readout. And amazingly, there happens to be one single continuous biosensor that exists in America today to be able to be prescribed and used, which is a continuous glucose monitor. It happens to be a really easy molecule to measure. So we can actually now put these sensors on our bodies that tells us literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, exactly how our blood sugar levels are fluctuating. And so if we look at that data stream, we put that sensor on our arm and we see the data stream on our smartphone because it's sending from the sensor to the phone, we can kind of see a bunch of different things. One, if that glucose is just consistently high, like higher than it's supposed to be, and consistently spiking really high after meals and taking a really long time to settle down after meals, that could be like a very overt signal that there's like pretty severe metabolic dysfunction going on. Like everything's just frame shifted up and it's like, whoa, I'm not in a healthy range. That's probably a sign that there's pretty decent insulin resistance going on in the body. For other people who might be more metabolically healthy, it can be valuable for them because their glucose may be generally in sort of like a healthy range. But what you can start to see is that when you eat certain foods, you might spike very high with some foods and be much more stable for other foods. And you can start to sort of parse out, okay, if I fundamentally don't want to overwhelm my body with glucose in my diet, because fundamentally that's just more work my mitochondria have to do, how do I eat and live in a way that keeps my blood sugar more stable, which we know is good for long-term health. It's also just good for like how we feel day to day. If I were to have a meal right now that spiked my glucose 100 points, that's not going to cause diabetes tomorrow. It's not going to cause metabolic function tomorrow. But what it will do today is that big spike will lead to a big insulin surge in my body to basically, my body wants to bring that glucose back down to normal and have the cells take it up. So a big spike will lead to a big insulin spike. And what can happen is you can come crashing down. So a big spike, big insulin spike, big crash. And that crash, which is actually called reactive hypoglycemia, which is where you sort of bottom out after a big spike, is often when people feel that post-meal slump. They feel irritable. They feel tired. They want to take a nap. They want another cup of coffee, brain fog. It's also when people crave more carbohydrates, because if your blood sugar crashes, the body wants you to bring it back up to normal. So there's actually been research in Nature Medicine, one of the premier medical journals, that recently showed that the extent of the post-meal crash actually predicts how many carbohydrates we're going to want later in the day and how many calories we're going to consume. So on every level, 1, understanding your baseline glucose, 2, understanding your responses to different foods and different meals, and 3, learning how to stabilize your glucose to prevent reactive hypoglycemia. So that's basically long-term, midterm, and short-term value. It's a really, really useful tool for just having a really actionable window into your lifestyle choices, and be able to cut through a lot of the nutrition noise in the ecosystem. And one of my co-founders, I had 4 incredible co-founders. There were 5 of us who co-founded the company, but I was the only physician. But my co-founder, Josh, is an aerospace engineer who was leading teams developing life support systems at SpaceX. And he speaks to this idea that when you send a rocket into space, obviously, if a rocket breaks down in space, it's very difficult to repair at that point because you're in space. And so a rocket will have over 10,000 sensors all over it to predict failure. The human body, also a complex system that we really don't want to fail, has 0 sensors on it. We don't put sensors on the body until it fails. So imagine if the rocket, we would not basically analyze anything going on inside of it until it fails, we'd be screwed. But that's exactly how we're approaching human health. And people actually in the healthcare system are demonizing the idea that it's valuable to give sensors to people before the failure happens, i.e. the overt disease develops, like type 2 diabetes, because somehow it's people call it a toy or a game or something like that. But really what it's doing is empowering people to make better choices and to understand this spectrum towards failure much earlier on and do the things in real time to essentially stop that from happening. So that's what the continuous glucose monitoring landscape is. And I think it's a really amazing tool that is just the start of, I think, the future of continuous biosensors that can tell us more about, our system's operation and what's happening and how we can prevent failure and promote optimization.
And speaking of that, with access to so much data, I'm sure personal as well as large scale, multiple people, what are some surprises about looking at blood glucose of a population or people? What are some things that maybe you have changed in your own life where it's just I used to eat this, I'm not going to touch that anymore? I've heard you talk about grapes before, where it's certain fruits tend to be okay. Grapes, maybe not so much due to lack of fiber and the fact that we eat them on their own, usually in the absence of other foods. What are some other surprises like that?
I think one of the biggest surprises is that breakfast foods in America are just typical breakfast foods are such a disaster for metabolic health. And in a very short period of time, we've really normalized these very high sugar, high carbohydrate breakfasts for people. You think about it's like pastries, muffins, bagels, toast, juice, cereal, fruit. Everything is essentially like a naked carbohydrate, very carb forward food. And we have so normalized that they serve like packaged muffins in public schools to kids. And when you see on the monitor what this is doing to people first thing in the morning, huge spike, huge crash, which, as we just talked about, that crash in the morning is going to set them up to be on this cravings roller coaster for the entire day. It is astonishing. So I think one of the things that people really get out of using a sensor is upgrading their breakfast to something that is glucose stabilizing. If you can start the day with stable glucose, it's so valuable because you just exit the glucose roller coaster and have more sustained energy. You aren't going to have that crash mid-morning and just set yourself up for a much more stable day physiologically, but also mentally and emotionally. So that's one. I think a lot of people end up moving towards much more savory breakfast. So something like free range eggs with avocado and greens, or moving away from oatmeal or cereal to chia pudding, which has fiber, fat, protein, very few net carbs, but still has that sort of like eat it with a spoon bowl feel to it. It's got similar vibe, but is like a totally different, macronutrient profile. Top that with some berries and some nut butter and some walnuts. A lot of people will have virtually zero glucose spike. People will often move from like a fruit smoothie to more of like a well-balanced smoothie. One of our advisors, Kelly Levesque, has popularized this amazing sort of smoothie formula called the Fab Four smoothie, which is like very well balanced between greens, fiber, protein, fat, and some like low glycemic fruit as well. So with that, you just get people creating alternatives to things that they, may have enjoyed that just set them up for a much better day. And something we do on the Levels blog is really give people ideas for like, okay, if you love toast for breakfast and you just really don't want to give that up, fine. Try it with almond flour toast. Try it with a seed bread or a seed cracker. Like there's every single type of food that you might like for breakfast that's causing blood sugar spikes. There is a healthier alternative that isn't about fully deprivation, but just slight swaps. The second thing that has been a revelatory for me and the community is the impact of sleep deprivation and poor sleep quality on glucose. I personally, who, I would say my metabolic health is extremely, extremely good in terms of looking at all my biomarkers together. I can put myself into the prediabetes range in a week if I just don't sleep. And coupled with other things, like if I'm not sleeping and I'm sedentary and I'm stressed, I can go from optimal fasting glucose, like 72, 75 milligrams per deciliter, up into the 100 range just by not sleeping. So you can basically not sleep your way into prediabetes. And I think that's something people really need to realize is that sleep is when we clear out all the mess, the metabolic mess. And there's been research to show that if you take healthy young men and actually deprive them of sleep for about a week and just let them get 4 hours of sleep per night, you can take totally healthy young men and put them in the pre-diabetic range. So really important to note that. And when you see how you're damaging your body by not sleeping, more than just your sleep data, actual biochemical data, it's definitely been a motivator for me to just like not compromise on sleep. And then the third one is just the profound power of walking after your meals. Simply moving your body in any way, air squats, dancing in the kitchen, walking around the block, better yet, walking for 20 minutes, but any movement will absolutely help stabilize the post-meal glucose levels, because even if you walk for 3 minutes, you have to realize like that is activating huge muscle groups, your quads, your hamstrings, your soleus, your abs, like you're fundamentally making all those muscles contract, which what that does, even if it's for a short period of time, is it brings the glucose channels to the cell membrane, because there's two things that can basically bring the glucose channels to the cell membrane: insulin signal, which will take the glucose channels from inside the cell and bring them to the cell membrane to let glucose in, or muscle contraction. So anything you can do to essentially coax the glucose channels to the cell membrane will help you take the glucose out of the bloodstream and process it through the mitochondria, or, store it as glycogen. And so I just would encourage anyone, like, even if it's a minute, even if it's 2 minutes, even if it's 20 air squats, do something to activate the muscles after a meal, because it will change the physiology of how you process the meal, which is fantastic. So yeah, so food swaps, breakfast being a real day killer, sleep and post-meal walks have been some of the most profound things I've seen. I could go on and on and on, but it's those are some of the ones that I think are pretty actionable.
On point. So helpful. Well, Casey, thank you so much for this conversation. What is the best place for people to find good energy levels as well as everything else that you're working on?
Thank you. Good Energy is coming out May 14th. It's wherever books are sold: Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, your local bookstores. You can learn more about it at caseymeans.com/goodenergy. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Casey's Kitchen. And then on every other channel, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, I'm Casey Means MD. So I also have a newsletter called Good Energy Living, where I share, what I'm thinking about each week in relation to health. So lots of ways to find me, but hope everyone just absolutely loves the book and that it really helps launch people on a new health journey. So.
Well, personally, this is one of the most important books I've read in quite some time. So I encourage everyone out there, go check out Good Energy. And Dr. Casey, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much.